Thank you for tuning in to the WOLA podcast. I'm Adam Isaacson, and as usual, I'm here to remind you that these podcasts are free. They're ad-free, but the Washington Office on Latin America is an independent organization. We operate entirely on gifts and donations. So please support our work. The easiest way to do that is just by going to our website, wola.org. There's a button at the top that says donate. Please do give generously and keep our work going. So on May 31st, Colombia held the first round of its presidential elections. No candidate reached the 50% threshold for an instant victory. So there's going to be a runoff vote between the top two candidates on June 21st. Those two candidates will be first Abelardo de la Espriella. He's a very conservative lawyer and outsider candidate. He mounted an aggressively effective social media campaign, really good at TikTok. He won 43.7% of the vote in the first round, which was more than any poll that I saw had indicated he would win. He had a lot of hidden support or a late surge. And second, Iván Cepeda, a close ally of sitting President Gustavo Petro. Cepeda is a longtime human rights activist turned senator. He has pretty orthodox left-wing views. Cepeda won 40.9% of the vote, 40.9, a couple of points fewer than most polls had predicted for him. In a distant third place, lower than I expected, certainly was Paloma Valencia, a conservative senator who had the strong backing of former President Álvaro Uribe, who, at least in the past, was able to motivate a lot of votes with his endorsements. Paloma Valencia won 6.9%, which means that when you put the two right-of-center candidates together, they already add up to more than 50% of the first-round vote, which means that the math for the second round probably favors de la Espriella, but anything can happen over the next 3 weeks. It'd be foolish to really actually make a prediction. In this episode, I'm talking about this with the director of WOLA's program for Colombia and the Andes, Gimena Sánchez-Garzoli, who is no stranger to the podcast. She's been on several times. Gimena has been following the campaign very closely and is in constant touch with partners all over the country. And she gives a really clear explanation here of who the candidates are, what their stories are, what was on voters' minds, and what may happen with Colombia's relationships to the United States and the Trump administration. Let's listen. Gimena Sánchez-Garzoli, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on the podcast again, Adam.
Now, of course, and we're recording on Wednesday, June 3rd. On Sunday, the 31st, Colombia held the first round of its elections. And I've already read in the introduction how they came out. You are on Colombia very closely. You are in touch with partners in Colombia all the time. Were you surprised by this outcome?
I can't say I was extremely surprised, but there were some surprising things that happened during this election cycle, which I think are important to mention. Well, first of all, I think we were all really fearing that there would be a lot of violence on last Sunday. And this really is something that includes two types of violence. First, political violence, just because in the past year and a half, we saw the assassination of a candidate. We saw heightened attacks against different campaign offices, saw death threats. We saw the killing of even of campaign staff and very aggressive social media attacks. So we all thought that this could lead to some kind of attacks. But then more generally, Colombia itself, its security situation is really critical. And there we've seen that you've had a huge rise in the illegal unroots from 2024 to 2025, some 5,000 more for a total of 27,000. We've seen an increase or almost doubling of kidnappings and an increase of murders in the conflict areas. You also had the International Committee of the Red Cross come out with its report saying that the humanitarian crisis in Colombia last year reached its most severe level in a decade, and largely due to illegal groups not respecting international humanitarian law. So there was concern about the voting sites, to the point that we, along with 34 other international organizations that work on it in Colombia, put out a statement saying that it was absolutely essential to guarantee voters access to the polling site, and also calling basically for calm in this election in terms of rhetoric and so forth. So that's the first thing. It was not violent, which is great. And this has been following a trend that we have been seeing since the 2016 peace accord, which I think is positive. The other huge surprise was that even though we all knew that Iván Cepeda would go to the second round and that one of the two right-wing candidates would go to the second round, I think the polls really overestimated Paloma Valencia and underestimated Abelardo. And so Valencia got like 6.9% of the vote. And what we saw really was a migration of the Democratic center voters towards Espriella. Some are saying that this is because at the end of the day, people want to be on the side of the person that's actually going to beat the other candidate. But we also saw that Valencia committed a lot of errors in the last few weeks of her campaign, and her campaign kind of like collapsed. She was really mismatched in her political alliance with her VP pick, Juan Daniel Oviedo, who is from the center and openly homosexual. And they actually had a public fight over key issues like drug policy and also the idea of naming former President Uribe as defense minister. She also, I think, was struggling with establishing her own identity outside of Uribe and not being in his shadow. And I think that a lot of her narrative was really like 2002 style, basically like a very different Colombia at that point, where that sort of rhetoric would have gained ground and Colombia has really changed. And she really contrasted heavily from De La Espriella, who was an outsider, but also, somebody who had these big concert-like events with dancing AI tigers, smoke, and basically also leaned into the whole global cultural battle that we're seeing taking place in a lot of different countries. And so I think those were two huge surprises.
As a more peaceful and also just, yeah, the polls seem to have been very off. It seemed like the polls were giving, when you added the two right candidates together and then compared them to Cepeda, who was seen as the front runner, they were both hovering in the mid 40s, like 45-ish
Yeah.
percent. But we ended up with Cepeda down around closer to 40% and the right wing candidates 8%.
Yes.
Does make Cepeda the underdog in the second round. Let's talk about the two candidates who remain. Now, where do they come from? What's their background? Their biographies seem mighty different, as do their styles.
Yes, they could not be more different. So, Abelardo de la Espriella is basically a criminal defense lawyer. He's a millionaire businessman, although he calls himself a non-politician, right? He's known for his very aggressive social media style, his very unapologetic rhetoric, and, showmanship, really. He was born in Bogota, but he grew up in Monteria, Córdoba, which is a region that has gone through a lot of agrarian conflicts and has had a very strong paramilitary presence. His father was a prominent magistrate who was close to former President Uribe. His mother is from a cattle ranching family. In 2002, he founded De La Espriella Lawyers Enterprise, which is a lawyers outfit that operates both in the U.S. and in Colombia. And his claim to fame really has been being very controversial in high-level corporate and criminal cases involving controversial figures like President Uribe. He represented him in several defamation suits, being an advisor to the AUC paramilitary group during the 2000 peace talks, and also representing Alex Saab. And beyond that, he also operates like a luxury menswear line and other luxury brands like wine and rum and coffee. He has citizenship in the US, Colombia, and Italy. And he sings traditional and classic music, and he's made albums. So his vision of Colombia is really one of the defending the homeland. He proposes an iron fist approach to security, ending all peace negotiations. He wants to build 10 mega private owned prisons a la Bukele, increase military and police budgets, eradicate coca in an aggressive way. And he supports the police shooting violent protesters. He also plans to enforce territorial control using the idea of the state of exemption. And while he says he's going to continue to support constitutional law, we know how that's played out in other countries. He is talked about doing mass detentions, which is another concerning proposal just from experience in other countries. And a la Bolsonaro from Brazil, he proposes to legalize carrying firearms for civilians as a matter of self-defense. This was something that was very big in the Bolsonaro campaign.
Before I move to Cepeda, you said something I didn't know. During the paramilitaries, the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia paramilitaries were in a demobilization peace process with the Uribe government. What was De La Esprilla's role?
He advised them.
He was in like an informal
Yep.
advisor or a
Yeah,
formal
he was
advisor
an
to
advisor to them. Yep.
no, yeah.
Yeah. So Iván Cepeda is a prominent senator, progressive politician, and he's well known as a human rights advocate. He's also a philosopher and a victim of Colombia's political violence. His identity is very much intertwined with Colombia's history in terms of the left, of being forcibly exiled. He lived in Cuba and in Bulgaria and in France. His life was very much marked by the assassination of his father, Manuel Cepeda Vargas, who was a prominent Communist Party and Patriotic Unit senator. The Patriotic Union was the political party that was formed when the FARC demobilized in the 1980s. That later was pretty much exterminated, like 3,000 people were killed by paramilitaries. His mother was a human rights defender, mostly in housing rights. His style is very serene. He's very intellectual in his demeanor. He's very much linked to left-wing activism in his speech and so forth. He even does a lot of his speeches reading a piece of paper because he wants to make sure that each speech is exactly catered to who his audience is. And his way of approaching things is really through legal and institutional maneuvers. He founded the movement of victims of state crimes, which was basically the largest victims movement of state crimes in the country. He's won human rights awards like the American Civil Liberty Unions Award. He is very well known, especially in the past year, for his fierce criticism of President Uribe, the fact that he was in a case against Uribe, and he was one of the first to signal out in the Congress the ties that Uribe has with right-wing paramilitary groups. So his vision really is to advance peace and negotiations with illegal armed groups and to focus on truth and reconciliation. He proposes advancing Petro's agrarian reforms, continuing the energy transition, and investing in education. In terms of peace, he's completely interlined with the peace accord. He was a promoter of it, an architect of it. He's said that he sees it as the solemn moral and political commitment to transform Colombia. He is advocating for it to be funded and to have certain areas advanced, especially the comprehensive rural reform and the PADETs, which are the territorially focused development programs located in neglected areas. He's defended the independence of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace and advocated for victims' rights. For example, in May 2016, he secured the political backing for the Congress Special Peace Seats, the CTEP, to continue and for have them to continue beyond their scheduled expiration date. His security proposal is a bit different. It's one of integral human security, which goes beyond the military response, focusing on human rights and dismantling the financial structures of criminal groups. Beyond that, in the regional security sphere, he really believes that there has to be a Latin American integration that looks at security, migrant protection, and that strictly adheres to international law.
And Cepeda's positions there do seem to resemble a lot of, and obviously has been closely aligned with Gustavo Petro, the current president. Their styles do seem to be quite different now.
Their styles, however, are incredibly different. I think that Petro is very personalized in how he presents himself and how he presents his proposals, while Cepeda is very much into dialogue with different groups and representing what would be like a common interest. So their styles are also very different in how they perceive and present the same issues.
Colombian voters going to the booths on Sunday with there were five major candidates at the time, but two very different visions among the ones that most of them voted for. What was driving them what was like the most prominent concerns on their minds as they were going into the booths?
The two biggest concerns are the economy and security, but very much security overshadowing everything. I think that there was a lot of feeling that the security situation is deteriorating, and it is deteriorating. Whether or not it's due to the total peace policy, I think is something that needs to be analyzed a lot further, because we saw the growth of the illegal groups already started after Santos, after Duque. So it was a trend that was going up. And so the question is whether it would have continued with or without the total peace. But very much that's a major concern. And then on the economy, the promises of addressing inequality in 3 years, which the structural problems of 200 years, I think were too much and overly ambitious. And so the two candidates have really different ideas of how they want to address the economy. For example, in the case of de la Espriella, he really wants to follow President Javier Milei's lead in Argentina, which is to cut
Deregulating
the government by 40% over 4 years, slash business regulations, cut taxes, and reactivate the hydrocarbon sector to drive growth. He has a plan known as Patria Milagro, so miracle country, which would reduce not only the state, but stimulate private sector by first cutting ministries and jobs, and then doing tax incentives for the private sector. He also very much plans his economic activity within a security lens, thinking that you need to have security as an economic driver to combat extortion and protect trade. Economic profile really would be a continuation of Gustavo Petro's economic plan. Basically, also, he would continue to guide Colombia towards this moving away from an extractive model to a productive, sustainable economy. Again, the comprehensive agrarian reform. He would look at land democratization, green energy transition, banning fracking. He also would promote popular economies through cooperative and community-led businesses. And he plans to focus more on domestic market growth and reducing poverty to boost consumer spending than the type of outside look that de la Espriella has.
One candidate promising sort of equity and one promising growth, although why that's a trade-off, I'm not sure, but we're not economists. You do a lot of work you do a lot of work in parts of the country with large Afro-Colombian, large indigenous populations, a lot of groups and activists in those areas. In those regions, particularly the coast, Caribbean coast, the south of the country, what was more prominent on voters' minds in those regions?
Well, if you look at the map of how people voted, you will see that the regions you just mentioned mostly voted for Iván Cepeda. And that is because over the past 4 decades or more, hardline security approaches for the people living there, which have led to militarization, have also come with a lot of human rights abuses. And they haven't seen that model has addressed their fundamental needs and rights, which is basic state presence with services provided such as health, protection, justice, and opening of markets for local economies. And so from their point of view, their biggest concern is regressing backwards to those types of policies. The whole concept of iron fist for them means a disproportionate impact on groups such as ethnic minorities. So they're very concerned about that, and racial profiling and what have you. In terms of the human rights and Afro-descendant viewpoint of the candidates of what they propose, Espriella, I really couldn't find a human rights agenda or platform in what he's proposing. Really, security and being an iron fist is seen as the way of guaranteeing human rights. And basically, what he has stated, though, is that he has obviously some concerns about multilateral organizations because he proposes removing Colombia from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights of the Organization of American States and the United Nations, because he feels that these multilateral organizations serve no purpose and basically just interfere with domestic security and state authority.
From the United Nations agencies like the Human Rights Council.
The United Nations agencies and council. Human Rights Council, yeah. I did not see any ethnic proposals either, no differentiated policies for Afro-Colombians. Basically, the idea is this universal idea that if you focus on security and free market capitalism without racial distinctions, and you get rid of identity-based agendas, that will create more corporate jobs. I have heard a tremendous amount of concern from multiple groups which we work with about how these policies could impact Afro-Colombian territories, and especially the rejection of international human rights bodies, because those international human rights bodies, like the whole process that started in Durban of the UN Forum of Peoples of African Descent in the 2 decades, had a huge amount of influence on Colombia, in Colombia, changing internal policies favoring ethnic groups. The United Nations was very critical in terms of supporting not just peace, but also ethnic rights, and in particular, the ethnic chapter of the peace agreement. So there's a lot of concerns that if these international human rights bodies and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and Commission are no longer engaging with Colombia, that a lot of those gains will go backwards. I would also like to mention that de la Espriella's view is to reject what he calls gender ideology and progressive social politics. And here, one of the groups that we work with closely, Caribe Afirmativo, evaluated his País Milagro plan and stated that they think that it represents a high risk of rolling back LGBTQI and minority rights. There is some concern from groups we work with in that front. In terms of Iván Cepeda doesn't have a strong history of working on Afro-Colombian rights. He has a strong history of working overall general victims' rights and indigenous rights. But in terms of what he's stated and what could be found about him, he says that he advocates for inclusion and empowerment of Afro-Colombian communities, groups such as the Black Communities Process, which we have worked with for many years, have stated to me that they believe his agenda will focus on ensuring historical continuity for the social movements and expanding their political representation. Under Petro, you had the greatest diversification in terms of ethnic groups in the government you've ever had, and especially in high-level positions. So they believe that he will continue in that vein. And his human rights platform is also very ingrained within following through on peace and total peace. And within that total peace, there are plans to continue to do social reforms and efforts that protect marginalized populations. In terms of,
I don't think we've defined total peace for folks who aren't following Colombia. How would you describe that?
So total peace is basically first implementing the 2016 peace accord and then dialoguing with the other illegal armed groups. In practice, it has resulted in the 2016 peace agreement not being a priority, but there being dialogues with the ELN guerrilla group, which was the second largest guerrilla group, although those did not pan out, and several other tables with dissident FARC factions, and also socio-juridical tables with criminal bans in 3 parts of the country. One in Medellin and Valle de Aburrá, another in Quibdó, and another in Buenaventura. And so the idea behind this was to take the lessons of all the prior efforts of demobilization and peace process in Colombia, where you'd have 1 or 2 groups demobilized, but others not demobilized, and because the others weren't engaged in any way in any sort of negotiation or any process or dismantling effort or what have you, that would undermine those processes. So the concept in it of itself is actually a very good one, but in practice, the way it's been carried out has been highly problematic and hasn't given the results that were expected at all.
And most of the policy supporters would agree with that. So meanwhile, you've got the various armed groups that have been in and out of the tables. The United States government, particularly under President Trump, has been adding them to their list of foreign terrorist organizations and urging a harder line. Let's talk about the United States. We have two very different possible scenarios of how relations between Colombia and the United States could go. Colombia, the number one recipient of U.S. security assistance, pretty much by far, so far this century. Maybe let's start with what has been President Trump's reaction to that first round.
Okay. So before that, it's just important to remind folks that Colombia-U.S. relations have been very strained under the current government of Gustavo Petro. And that has led to diplomatic spats, it's led to sanctions, it's led to decertifying Colombia on drugs, it's led to cutting of aid, and it's also led to Colombia, for example, not being invited to be part of the Shield of the Americas.
Right.
So we hadn't heard anything really from Trump until yesterday about these elections. We heard from him through his Truth Social media. And basically, his message was that he congratulated de Espriella on the victory. He called him intelligent, strong, and steadfast as a leader who loves the U.S. He basically stated that because of his achievements in life and political support for me personally, it is an honor for me to give Abelardo my full and total support. He also attacked Iván Cepeda, calling him a radical leftist Marxist. These statements are incredibly concerning. A president of such an important country like the United States really should not be endorsing one candidate or another in any country. However, this very much falls in line with what we've seen Trump do before, because he spoke out and intervened in the Argentine legislative elections, in the Honduran elections, and then last week he met with the Brazilian presidential candidate, Flavio Bolsonaro. I think that on the part of the United States, it appears that de Espriella's positioning, and even the fact that he's openly said that he wants to join the Shield of the Americas, that he wants to align with Trump policies on Venezuela, that basically he wants a Plan Colombia 2.0 and U.S. support for that. And also their like-mindedness on cultural and other issues would seem that that would make the relationship strong and that there would be sort of a symbiosis in terms of security policies and so forth. In terms of Iván Cepeda, I think that there would probably be an effort to dialogue with the U.S. I'm not sure how well that will go. I think that we will see a very different scenario in Latin America because most of the other countries in the regions have really been aligning themselves more with the Trump administration and taking action jointly in terms of Shield of the Americas, especially and in particularly Ecuador, that has been very much aligned with anti-narcotic strategies of the Trump administration. So I think that Colombia may be in a situation where they're the outlier and the opposer. Iván Cepeda has already very much condemned the U.S. military's lethal boat strike campaign, seeing it as an aggression towards Latin American sovereignty and against international law, and that bypasses due process. He, in general, is always advocating for shifting away from aggressive militarized action tactics and going towards diplomacy and human rights focused anti-narcotic strategy, and basically prioritizing like legal seizures over deadly force. So I do think that the U.S. and Colombia will more than likely butt heads on these sorts of policies.
And the headbutting would be less like the Twitter battles that Petro and Trump have had, but more like Obama and Lula sort of stance. We make your red lines clear. Meanwhile, the Trump administration all around the region has been asking governments to allow joint operations with U.S. military personnel to go after these groups. They've added 17 groups to the terrorist list in the region. Four of them are now in Colombia. And, a lot of countries like Mexico have said no. Ecuador, Guatemala, in a limited way have said yes. Espriella has said that he would not, allow U.S. troops to be in command. But I would imagine that the answer would be closer to yes, and it would be more like a no with yeah.
Although it's important to mention that Petro was very adamant against extradition when he first started. But
Was he during the campaign? Yeah.
yeah, and shortly, within several months of his presidency, he did negotiate with the U.S. and started.
Yeah, the ones involved in it.
So it's hard to know. I think it's going to depend a lot on the negotiations.
So maybe, unless you have more to add on issues, I mean, we could maybe just conclude by, looking at, the second round is June 21st. I think is that the result is going to be quite close. And Colombia was lucky in that first round to avoid political violence and to have everything, go smoothly around the precincts. We're able to report peacefully, but are you worried about renewed violence either in the day of or if there is a really tough recount?
I think Colombia is still very fragile and very much at risk of turning into violence very quickly. The emotions are running really high, both because of statements made outside of Colombia, but then also statements made inside of Colombia, especially because President Petro first has stated that fraud took place. We'll see how that pans out, but that doesn't seem to be holding up in terms of any of the electoral missions or any of the authorities there. But that is something that is concerning to some of the De La Espriella voters, that they may be attacked or so forth, right? So that's one concern. And then the other is that the standing president should not be involved in elections at all. That's not their role. And so I think it's going to depend a lot whether there's violence pre-election, second round election, by how that plays out. But then during the election, or depending on the results, again, if they're very close, that makes that risk even higher. Obviously, a more definitive victory either way will probably lessen that chance. But we have to see what's going to happen with the rest of the voters. I mean, Paloma Valencia has said that she wants her voters to vote for De La Espriella. We know that the voters in the center are very divided because who will be the lesser evil for them, so to speak. Basically, there are some that are likely Fajardo and Lopez voters to vote for Cepeda because they want to block De La Espriella, because they see him as a threat or a populist-style threat. But at the same time, many of them are also opposed to his plans for a constituent assembly. They don't like that. Another scenario could be that some of the centrist voters just feel so alienated by all of this that they do vote a blank vote. So we don't know really how this will completely go. But what we do know, that if you just look at the math, not considering what I just said, and if you were just to go in terms of what ideology people lean more on, the math does not favor Cepeda at this point. Cepeda would really need to reach out and engage with more centrist voters and on people who are not as like-minded, right? So I do think this proposal of having a debate would be very good. It's been very odd that in this president you haven't had debates between the leading candidates. And I think that could go a long way for either of them to reach folks that they don't naturally have following them, right?
Before we go, and I should have asked this before, but you mentioned centrist voters. What happened to the center here? I mean, you had two candidates who were pretty well-regarded former mayors, technocrats, institutionalists, regarded as not corrupt. And maybe one out of every 7 or 8 Colombian voters voted for a moderate or a centrist. And you took the major candidates and they went for the furthest left and
Mhm.
the furthest right. Does that just show like how alarmed Colombians are at the status quo? I mean, how do you interpret that?
I think it's two things going on. One is I think there's a lot of fatigue of this whole traditional sort of political parties and the whole idea of sort of coming together. I think there's a lot of fatigue on that because people are frustrated that their needs aren't being met or feel that they're being attacked really by certain sides. So they go to the extremes, right? Another is this is a global trend that we're seeing throughout the
Yeah,
world.
it's not just
The more sensible approach of coming together and building coalitions is not so popular anymore. More the extremes or the very hard line either way approach just gets a lot more attention, especially on social media, especially on
Mhm.
regular media. And I think that's what we're also seeing. I think there's an overall disgust with politics overall and with democracy overall for many different reasons and reasons that have nothing to do with democracy. They have to do with economic pulls and factors and global trade and changes and all that. But it gets reflected in these local elections at the domestic level.
Yeah, you're right. People's concerns plus the change media environment. You see these trends everywhere
Yeah.
on the left and the right,
Yeah.
where we are. But Mena, that was for those of us who are trying to follow Colombia, but not always following it. And that was hugely edifying. Thank you so much for that overview. And yeah, I mean, we're all watching closely what happens on the 21st. That ends in
Yeah.
the ends succeeding 4 years.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you again for listening to that episode, and many thanks to Jimena for that really clear explanation of Colombia's presidential election, the candidates, the issues, and the stakes. It's a really traumatic moment for Colombia and really for politics around the region. Please do stay tuned. We'll keep the podcast episodes coming. You can help us do that. As I mentioned at the beginning, as with all that WOLA does and produces, we depend on donations to make these episodes happen. If you're a supporter of WOLA, thank you so much for making all of our work possible. If you're not, just remember that very easily you could be. Either way, thank you for listening. Stay well and goodbye for now.